George Washington, 1732 to 1799, often called the father of his country, served as the first president of the United States from 1789 to 1797. His life journey, from humble beginnings in colonial Virginia to leading the Continental Army to victory and presiding over a new nation, set enduring models for leadership, civic virtue, and national identity. Born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Washington was the eldest son of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. His early years on the family's modest tobacco plantation taught him the values of hard work, responsibility, and stewardship. Despite limited formal schooling, Washington developed practical skills in math, surveying, and self-education, which would later prove invaluable. At age 16, Washington began working as a surveyor, mapping the rugged terrain of Virginia's western frontier. These formative experiences deepened his appreciation for the land, as well as his understanding of frontier challenges, skills that would support his later military and political roles. Washington's military career began in 1753, when he was sent as a young emissary to deliver a British demand to the French in the Ohio Valley. His daring journey underscored his courage and tenacity. The following year, he served as an officer in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War. Though he endured setbacks, including surrendering at Fort Necessity, he learned valuable lessons about leadership, logistics, and resilience. His toughness earned respect from both colonial and British officers. After the war, Washington returned to Virginia's planter class, marrying Martha Custis, a wealthy widow. His expanded estate at Mount Vernon depended on enslaved labor, reflecting the complex moral and social dynamics of the period. As a prominent landowner, he engaged in local politics, serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He advocated for colonial rights, while cautiously supporting reconciliation with Britain. As tensions grew between Britain and the American colonies, Washington's loyalty shifted. He became a delegate to the Continental Congress and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775. For 8 grueling years, he led a force that was often outmanned, under-resourced, and untrained. Yet, his strategic vision, built on endurance, unity, and adaptability, carried the struggle through dire winters at Valley Forge and pivotal engagements like Trenton, Saratoga, and Yorktown. Washington's greatest attribute was his ability to. Yet his retirement was brief. Recognizing the need for a stronger federal government, Washington supported the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Though he did not actively shape the text, his presence there helped legitimize the new Constitution. His unanimous election as president in 1789 reflected national confidence, and he was re-elected in 1792. As the nation's first president, Washington set enduring precedents. He established the structure of the executive branch, including the cabinet, and insisted on acting only with congressional authorization. He balanced regional interests by situating the capital on the Potomac River, easing tensions between northern and southern states. Washington faced significant challenges, forging financial stability, managing external threats, and keeping the nation intact amid growing political divisions. Under the guidance of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, his administration assumed state debts, created a national bank, and implemented tariffs, laying the foundation for America's fiscal system. He also confronted foreign crises. During the French Revolution and subsequent European wars, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793, asserting U.S. impartiality and preserving fragile stability. His decisive response to the Whiskey Rebellion, 1794, in which federal troops enforced tax law among Pennsylvania farmers, affirmed the authority of the national government and its right to enforce law. Washington's presidency helped cement core national values: voluntary power transitions, the rule of law, and constructive disagreement. He chose not to seek a third term, setting an informal precedent that became the two-term tradition until the 22nd Amendment in 1951. In his farewell address, 1796, Washington warned against partisanship, regionalism, foreign entanglements, and national debt, guidance that echoed through American history. After retiring to Mount Vernon, Washington devoted himself to managing his estate, experimenting with agriculture, and serving his community. He died on December 14, 1799, at age 67, from a throat infection. Revered in life and death, he was interred at Mount Vernon with national mourning and honors. George Washington's legacy is monumentally layered. He established the peaceful transfer of power, affirmed civilian control of the military, and prioritized unity over faction. As a veteran general and statesman, he modeled the virtues of restraint, responsibility, and national purpose. His portrait graces the dollar bill and $1 coin, while memorials in Washington, D.C. and across the country attest to his enduring, iconic status. Early life and family background of George Washington. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on the Pope's Creek Estate, a modest but prosperous plantation owned by his father, Augustine Washington. He was the first child born to Augustine's second wife, Mary Ball Washington, and the eldest of their 6 children. George's early years were shaped by the customs, opportunities, and limitations of colonial Virginia, an English colony ruled by rigid social structures, economic dependence on tobacco, and a growing class of landholding elites. Washington's ancestry was primarily English, and his family had been in Virginia for several generations. His great-grandfather, John Washington, emigrated from England to Virginia in the mid-1600s, establishing the family as part of the colonial gentry. By the time George was born, the Washingtons were well connected within Virginia society, though not among the most powerful. His father, Augustine, was a successful planter and entrepreneur who owned several tobacco plantations, operated ironworks, and speculated in land. Augustine had received an English-style education and instilled in his children the values of hard work, discipline, and public service. However, George Washington did not receive the same formal education his older half-brothers had. The death of Augustine in 1743, when George was just 11 years old, changed the trajectory of his youth and limited his educational opportunities. Mary Ball Washington, George's mother, became a strong and influential figure in his life. Widowed at 35, she chose not to remarry and instead managed the family estate at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg. Mary was known for her stern temperament and moral rigidity, often clashing with George as he grew older. Despite these tensions, she instilled in him a sense of duty, frugality, and personal discipline, traits that would define him throughout his life. Washington's formal schooling was modest and intermittent. He studied basic subjects such as reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography, mostly at local field schools or under the instruction of tutors. He never learned Latin or Greek, which were considered essential for classical education and social advancement at the time, and he would sometimes feel insecure about this deficiency later in life. Still, he made up for it through self-education, particularly in mathematics, surveying, and military science. In his teenage years, Washington became close with his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who had served in the British military and had married into the powerful Fairfax family, one of the most aristocratic and influential clans in Virginia. Lawrence owned Mount Vernon, an estate overlooking the Potomac River, and became a mentor and role model to young George. Through Lawrence, George gained exposure to high society, military life, and colonial politics. He also came under the patronage of Lord Fairfax, who would later offer George his first professional opportunity. At the age of 16, George began working as a surveyor for Lord Fairfax in the rugged lands of Virginia's western frontier, now West Virginia. This was a physically demanding and dangerous job, requiring long days of trekking through the wilderness and mapping uncharted territory. The experience gave Washington a deep appreciation for land, a first-hand look at colonial expansion, and a sense of self-reliance. It also began his lifelong interest in land speculation and westward development. Surveying offered a rare path for social and economic advancement for a young man of Washington's background. By the time he was 17, he had already completed dozens of surveys and earned respectable wages, allowing him to begin acquiring land of his own. His growing independence and confidence would set the stage for his next transformation, from land surveyor to military officer. Another defining feature of Washington's early life was his ambition and keen awareness of status. He meticulously recorded his expenses, practiced letter writing, and even copied out rules of civility and decent behavior, a list of moral maxims and social codes that emphasized decorum, humility, and self-control. These early efforts to cultivate personal discipline and public image became core to his adult persona. As a young man, Washington was described as tall, athletic, and reserved, with a commanding presence. He was an excellent horseman and participated in fox hunts and other genteel sports, which helped him network with Virginia's upper class. Despite his limited education, he was admired for his common sense, integrity, and ability to lead. George Washington's military career begins: the French and Indian War. As tensions between British and French colonial empires escalated in the early 1750s, the Ohio Valley became a flashpoint for territorial disputes. Both empires sought control of this fertile and strategically vital region inhabited by various indigenous nations. The British aimed to expand westward from their Atlantic colonies, while the French were building a network of forts linking Canada to Louisiana to control trade and waterways. In 1753, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, selected 21-year-old George Washington for a critical diplomatic mission. Dinwiddie's orders were clear: travel west to deliver a formal message to the French, demanding they vacate British-claimed territory in the Ohio River Valley. Though young and inexperienced, Washington was chosen for his frontier knowledge, surveying skills, and personal ambition. Washington's journey into the wilderness, accompanied by a small party, including the seasoned guide Christopher Gist, was arduous. The group faced freezing conditions, treacherous rivers, and encounters with Native American tribes who held their own interests in the conflict. Washington delivered Dinwiddie's letter to the French command at Fort Le Boeuf and received a polite but firm rejection. The French intended to remain. This mission, though diplomatically unsuccessful, brought Washington regional recognition and marked his first role in international politics. Dinwiddie published Washington's written journal of the journey, which portrayed him as courageous, articulate, and devoted to the crown. The first shots: Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity. In spring 1754, Dinwiddie again turned to Washington, this time to lead a small militia force westward to assert British control. The French had begun constructing Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh, and Washington was ordered to repel them. On May 28, 1754, Washington and his men ambushed a small French detachment under the command of Joseph Coulon de Jumonville in what became known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen. The attack, in which Jumonville was killed under disputed circumstances, possibly by Washington's native ally Tanaquarison, is widely considered the first bloodshed of the French and Indian War. Washington's men then retreated to Fort Necessity, where they were quickly overwhelmed by a French counterattack on July 3, 1754. After a day-long battle in the rain, Washington was forced to surrender, his only such surrender in his military career. The terms, written in French, which he could not read, inadvertently implicated him in the assassination of Jumonville. This diplomatic blunder gave France propaganda leverage and further escalated the conflict. Despite this early defeat, Washington's bravery under fire gained him a degree of fame, and he became something of a colonial hero. However, it also revealed the inadequacy of the colonial militias, the challenges of frontier warfare, and the deep disconnect between British officers and their colonial counterparts. Washington's next attempt at military advancement came in 1755, when he volunteered to serve under General Edward Braddock, the British commander sent to reclaim Fort Duquesne. Washington served as a volunteer aide-de-camp in the Braddock expedition, a disastrous campaign marked by misjudgment and cultural arrogance on the part of the British. During the Battle of the Monongahela, British forces were ambushed by a smaller force of French soldiers and Native American warriors. The red-coated British troops, trained for open-field European battles, were vulnerable in the dense forest. Chaos erupted, and Braddock was mortally wounded. Washington, though suffering from illness and with no official command, rode back and forth across the battlefield, rallying fleeing troops and organizing a retreat. He had 2 horses shot from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat, but miraculously remained unharmed. This extraordinary bravery solidified Washington's reputation as a fearless and composed leader. Accounts of his conduct spread through the colonies and England, and many began to regard him as destined for greatness. Some even attributed his survival to divine providence. After Braddock's death, Washington assumed temporary command of the remaining Virginia troops, though he faced significant frustration. As a colonial officer, he was repeatedly denied a British commission, something he deeply resented. The British military hierarchy often treated colonial officers with condescension, refusing to grant them the same status or respect. This experience sowed early seeds of disillusionment with the British Empire and later influenced Washington. From 1755 to 1758, Washington commanded the Virginia Regiment, tasked with defending the western frontier from French and Native American raids. These years were grueling. He oversaw the construction of fortifications, managed supply shortages, negotiated with native tribes, and tried to professionalize the poorly trained colonial militia. His efforts earned him the admiration of his men and the Virginia government, but he often struggled with the inefficiency of the colonial bureaucracy. In 1758, Washington participated in the successful Forbes expedition, which finally captured Fort Duquesne, ending the French presence in the Ohio Valley. Though he did not play a leading role in the final assault, Washington's experience and strategic insight contributed to the campaign's planning. After the fall of Fort Duquesne, Washington resigned from military service and returned to private life. At just 26 years old, he had already served 5 years in frontier warfare, gained a regional reputation, and acquired military knowledge that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. These experiences shaped Washington's worldview. He had seen the weaknesses of both British regulars and colonial militias. He had witnessed how political rivalries, poor planning, and logistical mismanagement could destroy even the best campaigns. He had also learned how geography, terrain, and popular support could change the outcome of a battle. All of these lessons would resurface when he led the Continental Army 2 decades later. Return to civilian life, political rise, and the road to revolution, 1759 to 1775. After years of demanding frontier warfare, George Washington returned to civilian life in 1758, with a solid reputation as a brave and disciplined military leader. At just 26 years old, he chose not to pursue a further military career, frustrated by the British Army's refusal to grant him a royal commission, and disillusioned by the chaos and futility of colonial war-making. In January 1759, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow and mother of 2 children, John, Jackie, and Martha, Patsy. Though their marriage appears to have been more of a practical union than a passionate romance, it was deeply respectful and enduring. Martha brought significant wealth to the marriage through land and enslaved persons, which helped Washington rise to the upper echelon of Virginia's planter elite. Together, George and Martha settled at Mount Vernon, a large plantation that Washington would eventually expand to over 8,000 acres. He devoted himself to the management of the estate, overseeing tobacco farming, crop rotation, livestock, and land development. Washington was an early adopter of scientific farming methods, experimenting with new crops like wheat and implementing more efficient tools and techniques. He was meticulous, keeping detailed records of everything from rainfall to labor productivity. Washington's wealth, however, was deeply tied to the institution of slavery. At its peak, Mount Vernon held more than 300 enslaved people, and although Washington later expressed private moral misgivings about slavery, he participated fully in the system as a slave owner for most of his life. These contradictions would shadow his legacy for centuries. At the same time, Washington was building a parallel career in colonial politics. In 1758, shortly before resigning from the military, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colony's legislative body. He would serve there for 16 years, representing first Frederick County, then Fairfax County. As a legislator, Washington was not known for fiery oratory. He was quiet and reserved in public. But his influence came through behind-the-scenes leadership, respect for law, and careful consensus building. Over time, he developed a strong sense of justice and constitutionalism, rooted in Enlightenment principles of natural rights, rule of law, and the importance of civic virtue. In the 1760s, Washington, like many Virginia planters, began to feel the pinch of British economic policy. Britain, burdened by the debts of the 7 Years' War, passed a series of revenue-raising laws in its American colonies. These included the Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765, which imposed direct taxes on colonial trade and paper goods. Washington was initially cautious in response, preferring lawful protest over outright rebellion, but he was deeply troubled by Parliament's assumption of authority over colonial legislatures. His correspondence during this period reveals a growing concern about taxation without representation and the arbitrary nature of imperial power. Washington had long seen himself as a loyal subject of the British Crown, but he began to argue that Americans were being reduced to second-class citizens under British rule. He also viewed British trade restrictions as an infringement on his economic freedom, particularly the Navigation Acts that limited where colonists could sell their goods. By the early 1770s, as more colonial protests arose, including the Boston Massacre, 1770, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773, Washington's stance hardened. He began supporting non-importation agreements, boycotts of British goods, and aligning himself with other members of Virginia's patriot gentry, such as Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee. The Coercive Acts, 1774, also known as the Intolerable Acts, were a turning point. Passed in response to the Boston Tea Party, these laws closed the port of Boston and effectively placed Massachusetts under martial law. In response, Virginia's political leaders called for a day of fasting and prayer and organized a Continental Congress to coordinate a response across the colonies. Washington was selected as one of Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia in September 1774. Though he remained cautious about endorsing armed conflict, he was committed to a united colonial front against British overreach. He wore his militia uniform to meetings, signaling his readiness for military responsibility if needed. In his letters during this time, Washington expressed a belief that armed resistance might be inevitable. He wrote of the need for self-reliance and warned that the colonists should prepare to defend their liberties. Though not yet a revolutionary in the full sense, Washington saw that peaceful reconciliation with Britain was becoming unlikely. In April 1775, armed conflict finally erupted at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. British soldiers clashed with colonial militia, and the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. News spread quickly through the colonies, and within weeks, thousands of volunteers began mobilizing for war. In May 1775, Washington returned to Philadelphia as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where the central issue was how to respond to the escalating violence. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but others recognized the need for military organization and defense. With his extensive military background, dignified bearing, and reputation for integrity, Washington was unanimously chosen on June 15, 1775, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Though he had no experience commanding a national force, or waging a long war against the most powerful empire on earth, he accepted the position with humility, declaring that he did not seek personal gain and would refuse a salary, only asking for expenses to be reimbursed. He left immediately for Cambridge, Massachusetts, where colonial forces had gathered to lay siege to British-occupied Boston. Washington now faced the daunting task of transforming a ragtag group of militias from 13 separate colonies into a unified, disciplined army capable of resisting British regulars. Washington's transition from Virginia planter and legislator to national revolutionary leader was now complete. In the years ahead, he would be tested as never before. George Washington and the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army in July 1775, he faced an almost impossible task: building a functional military force out of thousands of untrained colonial volunteers, forging unity among 13 fractious colonies, and resisting the greatest imperial power in the world, Great Britain. He did all this without a formal military education, with limited resources, and under the constant threat of political interference and defeat. The Siege of Boston. 1775 to 1776. Washington's first major challenge came at Boston, where colonial militias had surrounded British troops in the city following the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord and the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. When he arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July 1775, he found troops that were brave but poorly equipped, undisciplined, and disorganized. Washington imposed strict discipline, introduced military drills, and reorganized command structures. Supplies were scarce, morale fluctuated, and many soldiers had short-term enlistments. Despite these challenges, he held the siege through the winter. In early 1776, with the help of artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox, Washington fortified Dorchester Heights, a strategic point overlooking Boston Harbor. The British, now threatened by American cannon, withdrew from Boston in March 1776, a bloodless but symbolic victory that lifted American morale and gave Washington his first major success. The New York Campaign and the low point of the war, 1776. Washington correctly anticipated that the British would try to capture New York City, given its strategic location and harbor. He moved his army there in the summer of 1776, but the campaign quickly turned into a disaster. British forces under General William Howe, supported by a powerful navy, landed on Long Island and decisively defeated Washington's troops in the Battle of Brooklyn, August 1776. Washington executed a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River, saving most of his army. However, over the next several months, the British forced Washington into a series of retreats, pushing him out of New York and across New Jersey. By December, morale was at rock bottom. The Continental Army had suffered multiple defeats, thousands had deserted, and the revolutionary cause was in serious jeopardy. The Turning Point. Trenton and Princeton, 1776 to 1777. With enlistments about to expire and the Revolution on the brink of collapse, Washington took a bold and unexpected action. On the night of December 25, 1776, he crossed the icy Delaware River with a portion of his army and launched a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The victory was swift and decisive. A week later, he followed up with another surprise victory at Princeton. Though small in scale, these battles re-energized the Revolution and proved that Washington could defeat professional troops. The Trenton-Princeton campaign became legendary, a bold move that shifted the psychological momentum and revived public support. The Middle Years, Endurance and Strategy, 1777 to 1778. In 1777, the British attempted to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies by launching a campaign to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital. General Howe again outmaneuvered Washington, defeating him at Brandywine and later occupying Philadelphia. However, a parallel British force under General John Burgoyne was defeated at the Battle of Saratoga by American forces led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. This victory persuaded France to enter the war in early 1778, forming a crucial alliance with the American revolutionaries. While Saratoga was a major diplomatic success, Washington's army suffered terribly during the winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778. Troops endured freezing conditions, hunger, disease, and poor clothing. Washington's leadership in holding the army together during this ordeal became one of the defining acts of his command. During this time, Baron von Steuben, a former Prussian officer, arrived and began training the Continental Army in European-style military drills, discipline, and organization. The professionalization of the army at Valley Forge would be crucial to its future effectiveness. The war becomes global, 1778 to 1781. With France now involved, the war became a global conflict. British forces had to divert attention and resources to other colonies, especially in the Caribbean. Washington remained in the north, shadowing British forces and avoiding risky battles that might destroy his army. His strategy shifted toward attrition, keeping the army alive long enough for political and diplomatic developments, or British exhaustion, to bring success. In 1780, the war saw its greatest betrayal. Benedict Arnold, once a hero of the American cause, attempted to surrender West Point to the British. Washington was shocked and heartbroken, viewing betrayal as worse than defeat. Arnold's treason intensified Washington's sense of honor and duty. Meanwhile, in the South, British forces made gains, capturing Charleston and defeating American forces in several battles. But under the leadership of Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan, the tide began to turn. British forces, overextended and harassed by guerrilla fighters, began to lose control of the southern countryside. Yorktown and final victory, 1781. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, expecting reinforcements by sea. Washington, in coordination with French General Rochambeau, seized the opportunity for a decisive blow. He secretly marched his army south, while the French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, blocked British escape by sea. In October 1781, after a 3-week siege, Cornwallis surrendered, marking the effective end of major combat in the war. Though skirmishes and negotiations continued for 2 more years, Yorktown was the turning point that brought the British to the negotiating table. The end of the war and Washington's resignation, 1783. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States secured independence. Washington's leadership had been pivotal, not because of consistent military victories, but because of his ability to endure, adapt, and inspire. In December 1783, Washington did something almost unheard of in the history of revolutions. He resigned his commission and returned to private life. In a ceremony before the Continental Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, he voluntarily gave up power. King George III reportedly remarked upon hearing of Washington's resignation, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." That act of humility and commitment to Republican values set a lasting precedent for civilian control of the military and non-dictatorial leadership. Post-war retirement and growing concerns, 1783 to 1787. After resigning from military service in 1783, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon, intent on spending the rest of his life in peace as a farmer and private citizen. He focused on restoring his neglected estate, experimenting with crop rotation, managing fisheries, and developing industries like distilling and milling. Washington also maintained correspondence with former officers and political allies, and closely followed events in the post-war United States. But Washington's retirement coincided with a period of deep instability in the new nation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak, unable to levy taxes or regulate trade, and had no executive branch. The states operated like separate countries, issuing their own currencies, enacting tariffs against one another, and ignoring federal directives. Economic problems mounted, and civil unrest broke out, most famously in Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787, when indebted farmers in Massachusetts, many of them veterans, rose up against the state government. To Washington, this unrest signaled that the Republican experiment was in peril. In letters to friends such as James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, he warned of the fragility of liberty without a strong but balanced national government. Though reluctant to re-enter public life, Washington was persuaded to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, where his presence alone lent legitimacy and gravitas to the proceedings. The Constitutional Convention, 1787. When the Constitutional Convention convened in May 1787, Washington was unanimously chosen as presiding officer. Though he rarely spoke during debates, his steady leadership and impartial demeanor helped keep the often fractious delegates focused and civil. The convention produced the United States Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation and established a stronger federal system with a separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The presidency, as outlined in Article 2, was crafted with Washington in mind. His character served as the ideal for executive authority, exercised with restraint and republican virtue. After the Constitution was signed in September 1787, Washington retired again to Mount Vernon, though many viewed him as the only possible candidate to serve as the first president. To address anti-federalist concerns, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were ratified in 1791, guaranteeing individual liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and due process. Washington's presidency unfolded against the backdrop of the French Revolution and escalating conflict between Britain and France. Americans were divided. Some supported revolutionary France. Others favored Britain for trade and stability. Washington, committed to neutrality, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793, insisting that the U.S. would not take sides. This decision was controversial but crucial in keeping the fragile republic out of a potentially disastrous war. In 1794, Washington sent John Jay to negotiate a treaty with Britain. The resulting Jay Treaty helped avoid war, secured trade relations, and led to British evacuation of Western forts, though it was deeply unpopular with Jeffersonian Republicans, who saw it as too conciliatory. The Farewell Address and Final Retirement. By 1796, Washington was exhausted and increasingly disillusioned by political infighting. Despite pressure to seek a third term, he chose to step down, setting a vital precedent for the peaceful transfer of power. His farewell address, published in newspapers in September 1796, offered timeless warnings. Avoid excessive political partisanship. Beware of foreign entanglements. Uphold national unity over sectional loyalty. Value religion, morality, and education in civic life. The speech became one of the most important documents in American political history, revered for its clarity, humility, and vision. Washington's final years, death, and enduring legacy. 1797 to 1799 and beyond. After stepping down from the presidency in March 1797, George Washington returned to his beloved Mount Vernon estate in Virginia. He eagerly anticipated a peaceful life, focused on farming, managing his lands, and spending time with his family and close friends. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Washington was free from the constant burdens of military command and political leadership. At Mount Vernon, Washington continued to implement innovative agricultural techniques, experimenting with crop rotation, soil conservation, and new crops like hemp and flax. He also expanded his commercial ventures, including his large distillery, which became one of the most profitable in the region. Washington's interests in infrastructure development remained strong. He advocated for internal improvements, such as roads and canals, to enhance commerce and communication. Despite his retirement, Washington remained deeply engaged in national affairs through correspondence with political leaders and friends. He kept a watchful eye on the young nation he had helped found, concerned about the growing tensions between emerging political parties and the direction of foreign policy. He was particularly worried about the escalating conflict between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, fearing that partisan divisions could threaten the Republic's stability. In late 1799, Washington traveled to his estate after spending some time at his brother's plantation, Cumberland, in Maryland. On December 12, 1799, he spent a day supervising work on his farm and inspecting his horses during a cold and wet evening. After returning indoors, Washington developed a sore throat and hoarseness. Over the next 2 days, his condition rapidly worsened. He developed severe difficulty breathing and swallowing, a high fever, and swelling in his neck. His doctors diagnosed him with acute epiglottitis, or quinsy, a severe throat infection, although at the time medical knowledge was limited. Treatments involved aggressive bloodletting. Washington was bled several times over 24 hours, a common but often fatal practice of the era. Despite the efforts of his doctors, George Washington passed away on the evening of December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. His death shocked the nation. A revered figure, not only for his role in independence, but also for his exemplary character and leadership, Washington's passing marked the end of an era. News of Washington's death spread quickly across the United States and around the world. Tributes poured in from political leaders, citizens, and foreign dignitaries. Flags were flown at half-mast, and memorial services were held in major cities. Washington's body was returned to Mount Vernon, where a state funeral was held. His tomb at Mount Vernon became a place of pilgrimage and reflection. Though modest in its original design, his grave is carefully preserved, reflecting the nation's enduring respect. George Washington's legacy is vast and multifaceted. He is remembered as the father of his country because of his critical role in the founding of the United States. His leadership during the Revolution, his precedent-setting presidency, and his steadfast dedication to Republican ideals helped shape the nation's identity. Washington's character set a high standard for public service. He embodied virtue, humility, and self-sacrifice, voluntarily relinquishing power rather than seeking personal glory or dictatorship. His establishment of traditions, such as the peaceful transfer of power, the presidential veto, and the two-term limit, later codified in the 22nd Amendment, has shaped American democracy. While Washington is celebrated, modern scholarship also examines the complexities of his life. He was a slave owner who, despite personal discomfort with slavery, did not free most of his enslaved workers during his lifetime. Only in his will did he provide for the emancipation of his slaves after Martha Washington's death. Washington's policies sometimes favored the elite and wealthy, and his administration struggled with political divisions that foreshadowed future conflicts. Yet his efforts to hold the fragile republic together amidst partisan rivalry and foreign threats were crucial to its survival. Washington's image became a symbol of national unity and integrity. His portrait appears on the $1 bill and the quarter coin. Monuments, such as the Washington Monument in the nation's capital, and countless schools, counties, and towns bear his name. His life has been celebrated in countless biographies, artworks, films, and educational curricula. George Washington remains a central figure in American culture and history, representing ideals of leadership, courage, and devotion to the common good.